We begin with a story that is not about bombs, borders, or bailouts. It is about what is in your kitchen. Specifically, it is about a clear golden liquid that runs through the veins of the American food system. An ingredient so common, so cheap, and so overlooked that its sudden disappearance from the global market has done what no tariff, no sanction, and no diplomatic warning could do. It has broken the American snack industry in real time. Mark Carney just made a sudden unannounced move on canola oil. Not a tariff, not a sanction, not a diplomatic warning issued through official channels. This was a strategic restructuring of the global canola oil supply that affects every bag of chips, every box of cookies, every cracker, every fried food, every granola bar, and every packaged snack on every shelf in every grocery store in the United States of America. The reaction inside the White House was not fury, it was confusion. Donald Trump was caught completely off guard. His trade team was monitoring tariffs, energy exports, dairy supply chains, mineral restrictions, port access, all the visible pressure points of the 18-month trade confrontation. Nobody in the White House was watching canola oil. Nobody in the administration had classified it as a strategic vulnerability. And by the time anyone in Washington understood what Carney had done, the contracts were signed, the supply had been redirected, and the American snack industry was already scrambling to answer a question it had never once considered. Where does our oil come from? Let us take you through exactly what happened because the speed of this move is what made it devastating. Carney's announcement came without warning. No diplomatic preview, no leaked signals, no back-channel hints to Washington. It arrived as a formal policy declaration during a midweek economic briefing in Ottawa. That was not on the radar of any American trade monitoring team because the subject line, domestic agricultural processing investment, read like routine infrastructure policy. The announcement contained 4 specific actions, all enacted simultaneously with the declaration. First, an immediate 25% reduction in canola oil export allocations to the United States, effective within 14 days. Second, a $512 million investment in crushing and refining capacity designed to process raw canola seed into finished oil products domestically, rather than exporting raw seed for American processors. Third, preferential supply agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, and the United Arab Emirates, locking in long-term contracts that absorb the volume being redirected away from American buyers. And fourth, the establishment of a new Canadian Oilseed Sovereignty Board, with the authority to set export priorities based on Canada's strategic interests and the conduct of trading partners. The American response was chaos. Reports emerged within hours that Trump's trade team received the announcement via news alert, not through diplomatic channels, and that the initial reaction in the West Wing was confusion rather than fury. One senior trade advisor reportedly asked the question that revealed the depth of the intelligence failure. How dependent are we on Canadian canola? The answer, when it arrived from the USDA 45 minutes later, was the kind of number that makes rooms go quiet. Canada supplies over 75% of America's canola oil imports, which in turn represent the single largest source of cooking oil used in American food manufacturing. That number was not classified. It was not buried in obscure trade data. It was publicly available in the USDA's own commodity reports, published annually, accessible to anyone who looked. Nobody had looked because canola oil had always been there, affordable, abundant, reliable. And things that have always been there stop registering as vulnerabilities. They become background, and then someone turns off the background. But before we explain the full scope of what Carney's move means for the American food industry, we need to tell you something about canola oil that will change the way you read every food label for the rest of your life. The word canola is not a natural word. It does not come from Latin. It is not the name of a plant that has existed for centuries. The word canola was invented in 1978 by Canadian agricultural scientists. It is a portmanteau, a word made from combining parts of other words. And the words it combines are can from Canada, ola from oil, and low acid. Canola, Canada oil low acid. The product was developed by researchers at the University of Manitoba who bred a new variety of rapeseed plant specifically designed to produce an oil that was low in erucic acid and safe for human consumption at industrial scale. They named it after their country because it was a Canadian invention, a Canadian product developed with Canadian research funding, grown on Canadian farms, processed in Canadian facilities, and marketed to the world as a Canadian achievement. Americans have been reading the word Canada on every snack label in their kitchen for over 40 years and never once registered what it meant. Go to your kitchen right now. Pick up any bag of chips. Pick up any box of cookies or crackers. Pick up any bottle of cooking spray, any jar of mayonnaise, any frozen meal. Read the ingredient list. You will find canola oil. You will find it in Lay's potato chips and Ritz crackers and Oreos and Pringles and Pop-Tarts and Cheez-Its and Doritos and Nature Valley granola bars and Goldfish crackers and hundreds of other products that Americans eat every day without thinking. And every time you read the word canola, you are reading the word Canada. The dependency was never hidden. It was never classified. It was never buried in a supply chain document. It was printed in plain English on every package, on every label, on every shelf, in every grocery store in America. The word itself told you where it came from. And an entire country, an entire government, read that word every single day for 4 decades and never once asked, what happens if Canada decides this ingredient is no longer ours to take for granted? Canola oil is not just in your snacks. It is in virtually everything the American food system produces. Every major fast food chain in the United States uses canola oil in its fryers. McDonald's, KFC, Chick-fil-A, Burger King, Wendy's, Popeyes, Five Guys, Taco Bell. It is the default cooking oil in commercial restaurant kitchens from coast to coast because it has a neutral flavor, a high smoke point, and a cost structure that no alternative oil matches at the volumes commercial food service requires. It is the base oil in commercial mayonnaise, in salad dressings, in cooking sprays, in margarine, in bread and baked goods, in cereal, in tortillas, in frozen meals, in infant formula. It is used in cosmetics, in biodiesel, in industrial lubricants, in animal feed. The American food system does not run on canola oil the way a car runs on gasoline. It runs on canola oil the way a body runs on blood. It is in everything. It is in every meal. And 75% of it comes from Canada. The substitution problem makes the dependency functionally irreversible in the short and medium term. The theoretical alternatives, soybean oil, palm oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, each fail on at least one critical dimension. Soybean oil has a lower smoke point and a more pronounced flavor that changes the taste of fried foods. And American soybean production cannot produce the refined oil volume needed, even if every available soybean were diverted from other uses. Palm oil carries severe environmental and reputational liabilities that major food brands have spent years publicly committing to reduce, making a pivot to palm oil a branding disaster on top of a supply chain crisis. Sunflower oil remains supply constrained in the aftermath of the Ukraine conflict, with global production still below pre-war levels and available surplus already committed to European buyers. Corn oil is produced in insufficient volume and at a cost premium that would restructure the economics of every product that currently uses canola. There is no drop-in replacement for canola oil at the volume, the price, the quality, and the flavor neutrality that the American food system requires. None. The dependency is not a preference. It is a structural reality that would take a decade and tens of billions of dollars in agricultural investment to even begin to unwind. Now let us explain exactly what Carney did, because the move was designed to be impossible to reverse before anyone understood it was happening. The 25% export reduction was the visible part. Canada has historically exported a significant portion of its canola as raw seed, unprocessed, shipped to American and international crushing facilities that extract the oil. The $512 million investment redirected that model. Instead of exporting raw seed for Americans to process, Canada would now process the seed domestically, producing finished canola oil in Canadian facilities and selling the finished product directly to global buyers on preferential terms. The effect was to move Canada up the value chain from exporting a raw commodity to exporting a finished product, while simultaneously cutting American processors out of the supply chain entirely. The preferential supply agreements compounded the impact exponentially. The EU agreement alone committed 1.3 million metric tons of Canadian canola oil annually, roughly 30% of Canada's total exportable production, to European food manufacturers at prices 7 to 11% below current market rates. The Japanese and South Korean agreements added another 800,000 metric tons. The Indian agreement, which was the largest single agricultural trade deal between the two countries in history, committed 600,000 metric tons at preferential rates tied to a broader strategic partnership that included fertilizer, pulses, and agricultural technology transfer. By the time American food manufacturers realized the scope of the redirection, the math was already catastrophic. The available supply of canola oil on the open market, the supply that American buyers had always purchased without contracts because it had always been available, had been reduced by over 40%. Not because Canada stopped producing canola, but because Canada redirected it to buyers who signed contracts, paid preferential rates, and secured their supply before America knew it needed securing. When reporters asked Carney about the canola move at a press conference in Ottawa the following day, with the American snack industry already in emergency mode and Trump's trade team still assembling its first comprehensive briefing on canola dependency, Carney delivered 10 words that will define this chapter of the trade confrontation. A Globe and Mail reporter asked, "Prime Minister, American food manufacturers are calling this an act of economic warfare. What is your response?" Carney paused. He looked at the reporter with an expression that combined the precision of a central banker with the calm of a man who has been holding a winning hand and has finally decided to show it. And he said, "The label always said Canada. Nobody in Washington reads labels." 10 words, 2 sentences. The first sentence is a statement of fact so simple that it cannot be disputed. Canola literally means Canada, and the word has been on every label in every American grocery store for 4 decades. The second sentence is a devastating indictment of systemic blindness, delivered as dry observation rather than aggressive attack. Nobody in Washington reads labels. Not a boast, not an insult, a diagnosis. The wit made it more lethal than drama could have. It landed not as a threat, but as a truth so obvious that the only possible response was the silence of recognition. Within 20 minutes, the quote was trending in 11 countries. Within an hour, it was the headline on Bloomberg, the Financial Times, the BBC, Le Monde, the Washington Post, and every Canadian newspaper. Simultaneously, social media exploded with photos of snack labels circled in red around the words canola oil, alongside Carney's 10 words. The meme format was instantaneous and perfect. A split screen of an ingredient list next to a map of Canada, next to Trump's blank social media feed. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with it. One commentator called it the most efficient destruction of a trade position in the history of live television. Being caught off guard is worse than fury and worse than silence. It is the one reaction that cannot be reframed, cannot be spun, cannot be converted into strength. When Trump lashed out over the energy suspension, his supporters could frame the fury as fighting spirit, a president defending American interests with passion. When Trump went silent over the cheese move, his communications team could frame the silence as strategic restraint, a president choosing his moment carefully. Being caught off guard admits neither strength nor strategy. It admits only that the administration was not monitoring a dependency that was printed on every food label in the country, was publicly documented in the USDA's own reports, and was literally named after the country that supplies it. You cannot claim you were prepared when the warning was written in the product's own name. You cannot claim strategic patience when your trade team was searching canola oil supply chain online while the Canadian Prime Minister was giving press conferences. The consequences hit the American snack industry before the White House had finished assembling its first response. Canola oil futures spiked 19% in the first week after the announcement, the largest single-week increase in oilseed markets since the Ukraine conflict disrupted global sunflower oil supply. Frito-Lay, the subsidiary of PepsiCo that produces Lay's, Doritos, Cheetos, Tostitos, and Ruffles, issued an emergency supply chain review and warned investors of material input cost increases that will require pricing adjustments across our North American snack portfolio. Mondelez International, the parent company of Oreo, Ritz, Chips Ahoy, Triscuit, and Wheat Thins, filed a force majeure notice with 3 of its canola oil suppliers and announced it was evaluating all alternative oil sources, language that industry analysts recognized as an admission that no adequate alternative currently existed at the required volume. General Mills, Kellogg's, Campbell's, Conagra, and a dozen other major food manufacturers issued variations of the same statement within days, each acknowledging supply chain disruption, each warning of potential price increases, each carefully avoiding blaming Canada, and each implicitly blaming the trade environment that had made the disruption possible. The fast food sector was hit simultaneously and with equal force. McDonald's alone uses an estimated 200 million pounds of canola oil annually in its U.S. operations, and its supply contracts were among the first to be affected by the global reallocation. Restaurant industry analysts projected that fast food menu prices would increase between 6 and 14% within 90 days if the supply disruption was sustained, with the highest increases concentrated in fried food categories, the categories that constitute the majority of fast food revenue. A McDonald's franchise operator in Indiana with 6 locations calculated that the canola price increase would add over $350,000 to his annual operating costs. A family-owned restaurant in Chicago that had been operating for 31 years said they were considering closing because their cooking oil costs had doubled in 3 weeks, and their menu prices could not increase enough to compensate without driving away the customers they had spent 3 decades building. A food truck operator in Austin put it with the exhausted clarity of someone who had run out of patience for geopolitical explanations. I fry things for a living. That is my whole business. I fry things in canola oil because it is the best oil for frying and it has always been affordable. Now it is not affordable because 2 governments are in a fight. Nobody asked me if I wanted to be in this fight. I am just the guy with the fryer. The domestic political fracture followed the same pattern that every previous Canadian precision strike had produced. Fury directed not at Canada, but at the White House, concentrated in exactly the industries, states, and voter demographics the administration could least afford to lose. The Snack Food Association, representing over 400 manufacturers, issued a statement that was 1 sentence longer than necessary. And that final sentence contained the entire political indictment. We urge the administration to resolve the trade dispute that has created this crisis before it destroys the industry that feeds America's families. The trade dispute that created this crisis, not Canada's move. The trade dispute, the administration's trade dispute. Republican members of Congress from agricultural and food manufacturing states began issuing statements demanding an immediate reassessment of trade strategies that put food security at risk, language that any voter could read as the president's trade war is making your snacks more expensive. The American Farm Bureau Federation published data showing that American canola farmers, yes, America grows canola too, primarily in North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, were being devastated by the global price restructuring because Canadian canola was now flowing to higher-paying international buyers, while American farmers faced a collapsing domestic processing infrastructure that could no longer access affordable raw materials. The trade war was hurting American farmers who grew the same crop Canada had just weaponized. The irony was so precise it felt engineered. International reaction confirmed that Carney had once again created a template that other nations would study and replicate. Trade ministers from 12 countries requested briefings from Canadian officials on the strategic agricultural investment model. The European Commission published a working paper within 10 days, citing the canola move as evidence that asymmetric trade strategies targeting invisible supply chain dependencies represent the most significant evolution in economic statecraft since the invention of targeted sanctions. Brazil's agricultural minister said publicly that his country was evaluating which agricultural exports constitute strategic leverage that has been undervalued in trade negotiations, language that every trade analyst in Washington recognized as a signal that the Carney doctrine was spreading. Canada had not just made a move against the United States. It had demonstrated to every mid-size agricultural exporter in the world that the ingredients hiding in plain sight on American food labels were potential leverage points waiting to be activated. The consumer reaction was unlike anything the previous rounds of the trade confrontation had produced because the canola crisis came with a built-in engagement mechanism that no communication strategist could have designed better. Within 72 hours of Carney's quote going viral, Check Your Labels became a social media phenomenon that crossed every demographic, every political affiliation, and every age group. Millions of Americans walked to their kitchens, picked up the snacks they had been eating their entire lives, and read the ingredient list for the first time. The photos flooded every platform. Lay's, Oreos, Pringles, Pop-Tarts, Cheez-Its, Nature Valley, Ritz, Goldfish, every package confirming the same two words, canola oil. Polling conducted within 8 days showed that 71% of Americans had personally checked a food label for canola oil since the crisis began, and 63% said they had not previously known what the word canola meant. The most politically damaging number was this. 59% of respondents said the crisis made them less confident in the government's ability to protect American food security, a sentiment that crossed party lines and registered equally among Republican and Democratic voters. The label check did not just educate consumers. It turned every kitchen in America into evidence of the government's failure, a physical, tangible, holdable proof that the dependency was real, was printed in plain English, and was ignored by every person in Washington whose job was to see it. So here is where we stand. Mark Carney made a sudden, unannounced move on canola oil. A $512 million investment in Canadian processing capacity, combined with a 25% export reduction and preferential supply agreements with the EU, Japan, South Korea, India, and the UAE, redirected over 40% of the globally available canola oil supply away from American buyers. Canola oil futures spiked 19%. Every major snack manufacturer in America issued supply chain warnings. Fast food chains projected menu price increases of 6 to 14%. Franchise operators calculated whether their businesses could survive. Trump was caught completely off guard because nobody in Washington was monitoring an ingredient that was printed on every food label in the country and was literally named after the country that makes it. And Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa and said 10 words that are now on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. The label always said Canada. Nobody in Washington reads labels. The question that should follow every American from the grocery store to the ballot box, from the snack aisle to the voting booth is this. How many other dependencies are hiding in plain sight? Printed on labels, embedded in supply chains, named after the countries that control them, visible to anyone who bothered to look, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for the day that always available becomes no longer available, and the country that never read the label discovers what it always said. Trump built a trade strategy around the assumption that economic size is economic security. That the largest economy can always absorb the most pain, impose the most pressure, and outlast any smaller adversary. Carney built a trade strategy around the understanding that economic security is not about size, but about knowledge. About knowing which ingredients matter, which dependencies are real, which supply chains are vulnerable, and which labels contain information that the other side has never bothered to read. A $512 million investment in canola processing, less than the cost of a single aircraft carrier, less than a rounding error in the federal budget, has just fractured the American snack industry, threatened the cost structure of every fast food chain in the country, and proved that the most powerful economy in the world can be outmaneuvered by a country one-tenth its size that simply understood the supply chain better. Not because Canada is bigger, not because Canada is stronger, because Canada read the label. And the label that was always there on every package, in every store, in every kitchen in America, always said exactly where the oil came from. It said Canada. 3 letters right there at the beginning, C-A-N. It was never a secret. It was never hidden. It was the most visible dependency in the history of global trade, and nobody in Washington ever read it. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.